Do you believe in blood over everything, or not anymore?
Do you know your true worth? Because I thought I did until Christmas dinner turned into a quiet audit of my life, and if you are ready for a shocking truth, it began in the most ordinary way possible, with me washing my hands, hearing my aunt laugh in the hallway outside the restrooms, and catching the sentence that slid under my skin like a paper cut you do not notice until it stings. Relax, Maya is the family ATM, which landed with that lazy certainty people reserve for facts they have rehearsed too many times to question. I stood there longer than I needed to, not because I wanted drama, but because I was counting backward through years of holidays and birthdays and graduations where the check appeared and everyone looked anywhere but the center of the table. And I heard my own voice say the same line in a friendly tone I could repeat in my sleep. I have got it. Do not worry. Which sounded generous when I first said it, and then dutiful after a while, and then automatic in a way that had nothing to do with love, and everything to do with a role I never agreed to but kept playing because it stopped arguments and kept the night moving. I walked back to the table where the orders were still rolling in with the confidence of people who have never had to ask what something costs. And I listened to the jokes about the limited dessert menu and the suggestion that we add another bottle to make a proper toast. And I nodded and asked Grandma Ruth if she was comfortable and told Mom I liked her earrings. And I kept my face warm because anger would have given them a storyline they knew how to fight, while calm would give me room to work. When the server arrived with the check, he looked directly at me, not because he was rude, but because last year my card had been stored on file for this exact event, and I smiled and asked him to split the bill evenly across the table, to add the standard tip to each share, and to remove any stored card information in my name, which he did without fuss, and in that tiny pause Aunt Linda leaned back and said, bright and joking, that I was being dramatic and that the holiday tradition meant I covered the big night because I was the successful one, at which point Mom touched my wrist and murmured about keeping the peace because people get sensitive around the holidays, and my brother Evan, already on his second round, offered the kind of guilt that pretends to be compliment, saying I had a generous spirit and should not let little comments spoil it. I told them that generosity without boundaries turns into a job nobody applied for and that I had resigned, and I kept my tone so light it almost sounded like a toast, because I wanted the point to be unmistakable without inviting a scene. And when the server returned to confirm the split checks, I thanked him by name, gave him a look that said I was not here to make his night harder, and watched as the table adjusted to a reality where the bill did not disappear under my card like it always had. There was a shuffle of wallets and a flurry of questions about who had cash back on their card and whether the restaurant took a certain app, and I answered the only part that was mine, which was the rule going forward. And I said it clearly enough that even the cousins at the far end of the table stopped pretending they were not listening. From today on, everyone pays for what they order, and if we decide to split evenly, we split for real. Not pretend split where I quietly cover the difference. Evan smirked and asked if I had been keeping receipts like an accountant, and I said yes, not because I was building a case, but because I file things for taxes and the habit stuck. And I added that I would send a simple summary after the holiday with fair totals from the last year, and that anyone who wanted to settle could settle, and anyone who could not could propose a plan, and anyone who preferred to call it a gift could do that too. But that either way I would close the book, and once closed, no more silent favors, which made Aunt Linda laugh in that brittle way people laugh when they hear a boundary and realize the old tricks may not work anymore. Mom tried one more pass at the peacekeeping script, telling me that family traditions matter and that we should not nickel and dime each other over a single meal, and I reminded her, kindly, that traditions are choices repeated until they look sacred, and that I was making a different choice now, one that protected me from the hollow feeling I carried home after every big night when people hugged me at the door and told me I was a blessing while texting each other jokes about my salary on the ride back. The server returned with the split checks, and while everyone scanned totals and calculated their share, I pulled out my phone and opened the family group chat, the one with the cheerful name and the endless stream of photos and requests and half-promises. And I typed a short message that was polite and impossible to twist. Going forward, even split, No more silent covers from me. I will share last year's totals with receipts after the holiday so we can close the book cleanly, and I added the payment links people already use for everything else, and I pressed send, and I watched the little delivered ticks land like tiny gongs in everyone's pocket. Aunt Linda asked if we were really doing this over text like a corporate memo, and I told her that I was doing it in writing so that nobody had to remember who said what. And because written rules save families from the kind of fights that start as misunderstandings and end as grudges. And she rolled her eyes and said I was overthinking things, and I said I had been underthinking them for years, and that was how we got here. Grandma Ruth, who had been quiet through all of this, reached for my hand and squeezed it once, not as a side to take, but as a thank you for using clear words, and the server, who had no stake in any of it, looked relieved like every service worker looks when a messy tradition gets replaced by a clean process. We signed, we tipped, we walked out into the night with the awkward cheer that follows a polite earthquake, and in the cars and the ride shares and the kitchens people went home to, the chat started popping, first with jokes, then with questions. Then with the tone that comes out whenever money and family meet, which is to say sharp and soft at the same time, and I let it buzz while I drove Grandma home and carried her bag inside and promised to call her tomorrow. Back at my place, I set my phone on the counter and saw the messages stacking. Evan asking if last spring's birthday counted, Aunt Linda asking if I intended to invoice my own mother, Mom asking me to rethink for the sake of harmony, and Jenna, who usually avoids the middle, sending a private note that said she understood and that she would pay her share tonight, and I felt something I had not felt after a holiday in years, which was simple relief that my future self would not have to scrub resentment out of a credit card statement. I replied once in the group with the same calm tone I used at the table. I gave from the heart for a long time. Now I am switching to fair, and I promise the exact thing that made the room go quiet a few hours earlier. I will send receipts and totals after the holiday, and then I will close the book, and I meant it, not as a threat and not as a dare, but as a plan that leaves nobody confused and leaves me with my dignity intact. And as I turned off the kitchen light and let the phone keep buzzing in the next room, I knew the next step would not be a debate, it would be a ledger, and when people read their own line in it, they would have to decide who they wanted to be. The morning after Christmas always looks the same in our family chat with its predictable photos of leftovers and sleepy jokes about early flights and long drives. Yet this time the rhythm broke as the payment requests I had set in motion began landing on phones with the subtle weight of accountability, and within minutes the private messages started, some tentative and curious, others prickly and performative, each of them circling the same point as if changing the phrasing could change the reality that the bill no longer vanished into the soft fog of my credit limit. Mom tried first with a voice note that sounded like a lullaby played on a cracked speaker, asking me to consider the spirit of the season and reminding me of how I used to beam when I covered everyone, because generosity had always been my love language. To which I replied gently that love languages are not contracts and that, while I do not regret past choices, I am no longer willing to subsidize the parts of our family story that require me to be quiet to keep the peace, because peace, that is purchased one swipe at a time, is not peace, it is avoidance with a bow on it. Aunt Linda came next with the breezy tone she uses when she feels cornered but refuses to admit it, posting in the group chat a joke about corporate memos and holiday compliance policies, which earned the usual nervous laughter emojis from cousins who would rather pass the popcorn than pick a side, and when I answered, I did not try to match her performance, because I have learned that spectacle is the shield people use when they do not want to discuss facts. So I said, in writing and without heat, that separate checks were requested at the table, that the totals were fair and included an appropriate tip, and that moving forward the only expectation is clarity before we sit down, not guilt after the plates are cleared. Evan strutted into the conversation with a speech about how giving should be effortless and how scoring each other like a spreadsheet ruins the vibe of family, which would have sounded noble if he had not been the first one at every table to recommend another round he did not plan to pay for, and I reminded him, as kindly as a sister can, that tracking costs does not ruin the vibe. It reveals the vibe we already built, because if you feel offended by the math, it means the story you told Yourself about fairness never included your share. The cousins had planned a brunch for the following day, something simple at a spot with bottomless coffee and a waitlist that usually bends for us, because the manager knows our last name, and the last name knows my card. And as the time approached, I called the restaurant to release any stored payment information tied to me, and to confirm the reservation now required each guest to pre-authorize a minimum with their own card, which the manager appreciated because nothing makes service people calmer than rules that distribute risk, and when I arrived I felt a small, private relief knowing the line had been drawn before the first glass of anything touched the table. Cousin Jenna, who is always moved with the quiet grace of someone who listens before speaking, pulled me aside at the door to say she had already covered her share from last night and that she understood why I was making changes. Not because she agreed with every detail, but because she has also felt the slow resentment that grows when one person keeps the machine running and nobody else lifts the hood, and her support, even in that soft, qualified way, steadied me more than I expected because it reminded me that I was not demanding anything unreasonable. I was asking adults to act like adults. We were seated, menus opened, water poured, and for a rare minute the conversation flowed as if the old pattern had never existed, until Aunt Linda swept in late with her familiar air of smiling urgency. The kind that pretends to apologize while assigning blame, announcing to the table and to the manager hovering nearby that we could put it on Maya's tab the way we always do, and the manager, who had received my call earlier, responded with the professional calm that only facts can give, explaining that the reservation required individual pre-authorizations and that no single card would be used to guarantee the table. Linda laughed a little too sharply and said the manager must be new, then turned to me, eyebrows lifted with that dare I know by heart, as if she were asking whether I really wanted to make a scene over a little plastic rectangle. And I told her that there would be no scene because there would be no exception, that the policy was in place for everyone, and that if anyone preferred not to pre-authorize they could absolutely bow out and we would love to see them next time under the same fair rules, which drew a small nod from two cousins who had already completed the process and were clearly grateful someone else was carrying the awkward part. Evan tried the old fraternity move of mocking the manager about rules and hospitality, but the manager kept his eyes level and said the words that shifted the air around the table, explaining that without a pre-authorization from each adult, the reservation would be released back to the list within a few minutes because the restaurant had learned the hard way that groups who resist clear policies also resist paying on time, and I watched Linda absorb that sentence like it was a personal insult, when it was actually a neutral boundary a lot of places use now. Mom leaned in with a whisper I suspect she meant only for me, saying maybe I could just put my card down for the hold while everyone figured it out, and then we could settle later. And I told her quietly that later is the place where my resentment lives. That later is the word that keeps me up at night reconciling numbers nobody else wants to see, and that as hard as this moment is, it is easier than pretending I am fine while my stomach knots at the thought of another bill that disappears into the family fog. Jenna took out her card and completed the process without commentary, then looked at Linda with a simple question that landed heavier than any speech, asking why a grown woman who can plan a holiday cruise and a kitchen remodel cannot press a button on a payment app like the rest of us, and the silence that followed told me the performance had lost its audience, because even the cousins who love a good stir were not willing to lose a table they had waited for just to preserve a myth about my role. Linda reached slowly for her wallet, then stalled by asking whether the manager could make an exception just this once since it was the holidays, and we were family, and the manager, in that careful customer service tone that protects both the guest and the staff, repeated that the policy is the policy, that the wait list is long, and that he could hold the table for a few more minutes while we decided, which placed the choice exactly where it belonged, not with me, not with the manager, but with the person who had spent years treating my quiet funding as a birthright. I sat back, took a breath I let no one see, and said nothing else, because the moment did not need another argument, it needed reality to do its slow, honest work. And as Linda rifled through a purse that has always contained every card except the one she wants to use when it counts, the manager checked his watch and explained, in a voice free of malice or performance, that if a card was not provided in 5 minutes, the reservation would be released to the next party waiting by the door. The day after the brunch standoff felt like the right time to stop reacting and start cleaning, so I made coffee, opened my laptop, and pulled up the quiet list that had lived in my head for years, but never had a home in writing. The list of recurring charges I had absorbed, because it was easier in the moment to add one more line than to start a hard conversation. And I began converting that fog into simple statements that anyone could understand without needing my patience as a translator, which sounded unglamorous, but felt like oxygen. I started with the family phone plan because it was the oldest cord tying me to this role, the one that began with an emergency when Evan's phone died during a job hunt and turned into a permanent second line that somehow multiplied into a third. And I drafted a clear message that explained the transfer process in steps that even someone who hates paperwork could follow, letting them know that within 30 days the lines attached to their names would move under their care, that their numbers would stay the same, and that if they wanted to keep the discount they could qualify on their own plan by bundling the way adults do when they are not leaning on a sister they like to call generous in public and high maintenance in private. Next came the streaming accounts that drifted across living rooms like smoke, the ones everyone claimed they barely used while sending me late-night texts about broken logins and new episodes. So I set the calendar to cancel renewals at the end of the current cycle, wrote out clean instructions for how to create individual accounts, and added a line I knew would rub against the habit of entitlement but needed to live in the open. A line that said, "I love watching the same shows and I will happily trade recommendations, yet I will not be the group's backdoor subscription anymore. Not because I am stingy, but because I refuse to teach myself that affection equals access to my wallet." Medical leftovers required more care because copays and prescriptions tied to my mother's anxiety or my aunt's knee have a way of sneaking into the moral category where money becomes a test of character. So I wrote those messages with the steadiness of a person who wants to help and also wants the help to be structured, telling my mother that I would continue to be her emergency contact and drive her to appointments when I could, that I would show up with a bag of groceries when she needed comfort, and that for medical costs specifically we would create a small family pool with equal contributions from the adults who can afford it, governed by a simple rule where receipts are visible to contributors and decisions require agreement from at least 2 adults other than the patient, which is not cold or cruel. It is fair and humane, because it protects both dignity and accountability. By noon I had sent the notices with calm subject lines and readable paragraphs, and while the replies came in a scatter of tones, Evan claiming this was punishment for old sibling drama, Aunt Linda insisting the timing was vindictive given the holidays, Mom pleading to keep things as they are until spring, I stayed with one sentence that kept the ground under my feet, which stated that clarity now prevents bitterness later, and that if anyone needed help with the transfer steps I would help. Once, not forever, and that my calendar had room for a single setup call per person so that nobody felt abandoned and I did not become tech support on retainer. Somewhere between those emails and a quick walk to clear my head, a call from an unfamiliar number buzzed through. And the person introduced herself as the events coordinator from a downtown venue who wanted to confirm the head count and the card on file for a New Year's gathering booked under my name, which surprised me because I had not booked anything. And within a breath I recognized the move as one I have seen before. The last minute, it is already set. We cannot change it now, trap that. Counts on my conflict aversion more than my memory, so I asked her to hold while I added the family chat to a new thread and then, with everyone listening, I thanked the coordinator for reaching out and told her there must be a misunderstanding because I had not reserved a thing, and that if the host who used my name could please identify themselves we could straighten it out. Silence, the kind that says a plan just lost its legs, held for a beat before Aunt Linda appeared with a message about how she only used my name to speed things up and how the venue needed a single guarantor because it was a holiday package and these things are complicated, which was the exact sentence I was waiting for. Because complicated is their favorite word when they want me to shut up and pay, and I asked the coordinator if the venue could handle separate checks and individual authorizations instead of a single guarantor, and she said of course, that they did it all the time for corporate groups and large families, and that it actually made their staff feel safer on busy nights. So I said, perfect. Please switch the booking to that model and remove my name as guarantor, and thank you for documenting the change by email to the host and to me. The coordinator confirmed, sent the email while still on the call, and wished us a wonderful celebration, and as the thread lit up with attempts to reframe the moment, Evan with a shrugging joke about me being allergic to fun, Linda with a condescending line about bureaucracy killing joy, cousin Jenna stepped in with a single sentence that did more than any speech, saying that separate checks are normal now and that there is nothing festive about pretending adults cannot press a button on a payment app, and sometimes I think that is all change requires. One person refusing to normalize what only benefits the loudest person in the room. With the venue reset and the recurring charges scheduled to move, I sent the thing I had promised on Christmas night, the year-end settlement, which was not a spreadsheet meant to shame anyone, but a clear page with dates and events and simple totals next to names, along with a short note that offered 3 paths because I had learned that people comply more easily when they can choose their dignity. So I wrote that anyone ready to clear their line could pay in full and be done, that anyone who needed time could propose a plan in writing for the next few months, and that anyone who preferred not to revisit the past could reply with the word gift, and I would mark the balance as forgiven, after which there would be no revisiting and no grudges. Only the understanding that we do not repeat the past under a prettier label. Messages trickled in, some respectful and prompt, some snide and delayed, and I let them land without rushing to resolve feelings that were not mine to manage, because the point of this entire exercise was not to win a debate, it was to restore a boundary. And as the afternoon faded, I set my phone face down and started chopping vegetables, a domestic task I used to pair with soothing podcasts, but now paired with silence so I could hear my own thoughts without a chorus layered over them. The ringtone I will always answer no matter what I am cooking broke that silence, and when I saw Grandma Ruth's name I wiped my hands and picked up on the first ring, and she said, in that steady voice that never rushes even when time is short, that she had seen the messages and wanted me to come by tomorrow if I could because she wanted to talk without the noise of the group, which landed in my chest like both a comfort and a summons, and before we hung up she added, almost as an aside, but somehow heavier than anything else I had heard all day, that fairness is not cruelty and that she hoped I was not bracing for a fight when a conversation might do, and I told her I would be there, because when the quiet center of your family asks for your time, you show up ready to listen and to be understood, even if you are not sure which one you will get. I drove to Grandma Ruth's house the next afternoon with the same knot in my stomach I used to feel before a job interview, because I knew this was not going to be another loud family debate where people hid behind jokes and interruptions, but a quieter test of whether my choices could survive the gaze of the one person whose opinion had always mattered most to me. When she opened the door, she did not ask how traffic was or whether I wanted coffee right away. She simply touched my arm, led me to the kitchen table, and said, in the tone that meant no performance would be tolerated, tell me everything from the beginning, and leave nothing out. So I told her, slowly, about the bathroom moment at Christmas when Linda's words cut through all the noise, about how I sat back down and waited for the bill because I realized a truth I had been avoiding for years, that my silence had written me into a role nobody ever asked me if I wanted, and about how splitting that check was not just about one night's money, but about ending a pattern that had been eroding me piece by piece. I told her about the brunch reservation where the new rules held and the manager, not me, became the voice of boundaries, and I told her about the morning I spent going through every account, every subscription, every hidden obligation, and sending out the notices that I should have sent years ago. She listened without interrupting except once, when I mentioned Mom's pleading and Linda's spin about greed, and she lifted a hand and said, do not soften their words for me. I have heard the same lines in different mouths for decades. That small interjection felt like permission to stop cushioning things, so I spoke plainly about Evan's entitlement, about Mom's preference for peace over fairness, about Linda's habit of pushing me into corners under the cover of tradition, and about how every time I paid to avoid conflict, I thought I was buying harmony when really I was paying for silence that only I carried home. When I finished, Grandma sat for a long time without speaking, staring at her folded hands in a way that made me nervous until she finally said, "Fair is not mean, and you are not wrong to want it. But you need to decide if your fight is with the money or with the story the money tells." I asked her what she meant, and she explained that if I only fixed the payments without addressing the family's belief that I was built to carry them, then the pattern would mutate and find another way to trap me. But if I told them with actions and rules that I would no longer play that role, then the story itself would end, and everyone would be forced to find a new one. That was when I laid out the idea I had been shaping quietly, the prepaid pool system, a simple rule where any family event required everyone to load their equal share before the first plate hit the table. No single guarantor, no IOUs. No late-night guilt messages, and I asked her if she thought it was too cold, too transactional, too corporate for a family. She smiled, the kind of smile that makes wrinkles look like medals, and said, "No, it sounds like what families forget too often. Responsibility shared is love shared." With her blessing, I typed the message in the family chat right there at the kitchen table, explaining the new system in clear steps, attaching screenshots from the restaurant manager who had backed me up, and inviting anyone who wanted to host to use the pool as their safety net. Predictably, Linda fired back a long paragraph dripping with sarcasm about how I was turning family into an accounting department, and how she was embarrassed to think of outsiders watching us nickel and dime our way through holidays. But before I could even decide whether to respond, Grandma herself typed a single sentence that landed like a hammer wrapped in velvet. "If you call the person who carried you greedy, that says more about you than about her." The effect was instant. The chat went silent for a moment, then Jenna chimed in with, "I will host next month using Maya's system," and 2 cousins followed with quick yes. Not because they wanted to take a side in a feud, but because they were tired of the endless uncertainty about who was covering what. It was the first time I realized that my resistance might not just protect me, but also liberate the quieter ones who had been waiting for someone else to break the pattern. That evening, while I was still digesting the relief of Grandma's support, another kind of revelation arrived, this time by accident. A bank alert popped up in the chat, clearly sent by mistake from Linda's shared account, showing a charge for a luxury handbag made minutes after she had refused to preload her share into the pool, and the sight of that receipt, unfiltered, undeniable, made the group pause in a way no speech ever could. She scrambled to delete it, then started typing those frantic dots that hang in the chat like a drum roll. But the damage was already done, because for once it was not my word against hers, it was her own spending against her own excuses. I did not pile on, though I wanted to, because the silence of the others was louder than anything I could have said, and I realized this was the kind of moment you let breathe on its own. What struck me most was not the mistake itself, but the way it revealed what I had suspected all along. That the people who call you greedy for protecting yourself are often the same ones who never hesitate to indulge themselves once they are sure someone else will handle the bill. I ended the night by sending a brief message that said only, "Fairness is not cruelty, and this system is not punishment. It is freedom from the resentment none of us should have to carry anymore," and I closed my phone before the replies could arrive. For the first time in a long time, I felt not only relief but also the faint edge of anticipation, because while I knew the storm was not over, I had allies now. I had Grandma's words as a shield. And I had exposed the cracks in Linda's performance in a way that could not be patched over with charm. But as I turned off the lights and climbed into bed, one thought echoed above all the others, a thought that felt less like a question and more like a promise. I still had one last move to make, the move that would end the story for good. And the family had no idea what it was going to be. The final holiday gathering came sooner than I expected, and by then the tension in the family chat had settled into a brittle politeness, the kind that pretends everything is normal while everyone knows the ground has shifted. And I walked into that room with a strange calm because I had already decided this was the day I would end the story on my terms, not with another argument or another leak of resentment, but with a rule so clear and irreversible that no one would be able to twist it back into obligation. The meal itself went smoothly, partly because the prepaid pool had already done its quiet work, with every adult loading their share days before. And partly because people had begun to understand that the silence I used to give them when I paid for everything had been replaced with boundaries they could not ignore, and so the chatter was lighter, the glances sharper. And the absence of tension around the check almost felt like a new holiday tradition being born right in front of us. For most of the evening, I let things play out without pressing, laughing at small jokes, passing dishes to Grandma Ruth, nodding when cousins asked about work, but underneath I was carrying the weight of the one last move I had prepared. The move I had hinted at in earlier conversations when I said I wanted to close the book fully, not just on the past bills, but on the future dynamics that had allowed those bills to keep appearing under my name. The moment finally came when the plates were being cleared and the mood should have been winding down, and that was when Aunt Linda, arriving late with the usual air of self-importance, decided to test the edges of the new system by saying in a voice pitched just loud enough for the whole table to hear that she hoped I had brought my card because, as always, there were extras and overages that needed to be handled. In the past, I would have sighed, swallowed my irritation, and paid just to make the evening end without conflict, but this time I stood, not abruptly but firmly, thanked everyone for following the new system, and told them I had one final announcement that would mark the close of this entire chapter in our family story. I explained that while I was cleaning up accounts and settling old obligations, I had set aside a small separate fund in Grandma Ruth's name only, with no connection to my personal cards and no hidden reliance on anyone else's promises, and that this fund would exist solely to cover her needs, whether that meant prescriptions, repairs, or something as simple as a birthday cake when she wanted to celebrate, and that any family member who wanted to contribute could do so, with the guarantee that every dollar would be logged and every contributor would have full access to the receipts, but that nobody would be pressured, nobody would be shamed, and nobody would ever again be able to use Grandma's needs as a way to force me, or anyone else, into silent funding. The table went quiet in a way that did not feel hostile but stunned, as if the rules of gravity had been rewritten in front of them. And I could see in their faces the realization that I had not only withdrawn from the role of guarantor, but had replaced the system entirely with something transparent, undeniable, and immune to guilt. Linda tried to recover her footing by accusing me of weaponizing money, her voice rising in the familiar cadence of outrage she uses when she wants to create chaos, but I met her gaze and said evenly that what I had done was remove money as a weapon. That this was not about punishment, but about ending the cycle where generosity became an obligation and obligation became resentment. To my surprise, it was Jenna who spoke first after me, saying she would happily contribute to the Grandma Fund because it was the first time she had ever seen fairness built into a family system instead of taken for granted, and Evan, who had spent weeks making sarcastic comments in the chat, nodded quietly and said he would add something too, not with enthusiasm, but with the resignation of someone who knows the wind has shifted and resistance will only make him look worse. Even Mom, who had begged me for harmony more times than I could count, squeezed my hand under the table and said she understood now that what I had done was not cruel but necessary, because harmony bought with one person's silence is not harmony at all. That was when I made the move I had been saving, the one that would end not just the old obligations, but the possibility of them creeping back, and I read a single sentence I had written on a note card in my purse. From today on, I am never the guarantor. Never the card on file and never the secret backup plan. I am family, not a bank. I let the words hang in the air, not rushing to fill the silence, because I wanted them to land with the finality they deserved. And then I added the only thing that could make the ending both sharp and clean, telling them that for those who never paid their share from the settlement I had offered, I was forgiving the debt entirely, not because I had forgotten, not because I did not care, but because I was closing the book once and for all. And from this point forward there would be no open balances, no running tabs, and no leverage. The look on Linda's face was almost comical, caught between outrage that I had denied her the satisfaction of another fight and disbelief that I had stripped her of the narrative that I was greedy or petty, because forgiving the debt robbed her of the last weapon she thought she had. Grandma smiled, the kind of smile that carries both relief and approval, and said softly, "It is done then. the book is closed, and in that moment the power dynamic that had governed our family gatherings for years simply evaporated, leaving behind something quieter and, for me at least, more honest than I had ever thought possible. As the evening wound down, I noticed how differently people moved. Cousins chatted without glancing at me for cues. Mom looked lighter even as she processed the change, and Linda, stripped of her usual role, sat back with the restless energy of someone who has lost her script and does not know what part to play anymore. I walked Grandma out, kissed her cheek, and felt for the first time in years that I had not only survived a holiday, but had walked away with dignity intact and resentment dissolved. Driving home, I kept replaying the last line in my head: I am family, not a bank, and I realized it was not just a statement to them but a promise to myself, a boundary so clear it could not be eroded by guilt or performance. And I felt a sense of relief that bordered on joy because I knew that even if the family tested me again, the system I had put in place, the fund I had created for Grandma, and the debt I had forgiven had rewritten the rules forever. The lingering question, the one that will probably never leave me, is what happens to a family when the person who has carried them quietly steps back and demands fairness. But the answer I know for myself is simple. You finally breathe, you finally sleep, and you finally live as more than a wallet with a smile.